On April 11th, 4 people climbed out of a metal capsule into the Pacific Ocean sunlight. They had been gone 10 days. They had traveled further from Earth than any human being since December 1972, or they had seen things that no amount of training, no simulation, no photograph in any textbook had prepared them for. Reed Wiseman described it afterward with the particular flatness of someone still processing something too large for ordinary language. He said the view was something no amount of training could have prepared him for. That when he looked back at Earth from deep space, he understood something he had previously only known intellectually. He didn't elaborate immediately. He didn't need to. There is a specific kind of silence that follows when an astronaut tries to describe what Earth looks like from 250,000 miles away. It is not the silence of someone who has nothing to say. It is the silence of someone who has looked at something that language was not built to carry. This is what they saw. This is what happened to 4 human beings when they left the only world our species has ever called home and traveled further into the dark than anyone alive had ever gone. Start with the moment of departure, because it is not what most people imagine. There is no gradual transition, no slow fading of Earth behind you as you drift outward. The Space Launch System, producing 8.8 million pounds of thrust at liftoff, does not ease you gently into space. It detonates beneath you. The acceleration is approximately 3 times the force of gravity pressing you into your seat. The vibration is described by astronauts consistently as something that inhabits your body rather than something you observe. It moves through your chest, through your vision, through your back teeth. It lasts approximately 8 minutes, and then it stops. The engines cut off. The vibration vanishes. And in the sudden silence, the crew of Artemis II was in orbit. Reed Wiseman, Victor Glover, Christina Koch, and Jeremy Hansen. 4 human beings in a capsule, approximately the size of 2 minivans parked side by side, traveling at approximately 28,000 kilometers per hour, orbiting Earth once every 90 minutes. For the first few orbits, Earth fills the windows, not a distant sphere, a present. The curvature visible at the edges, but the surface close enough to resolve individual weather systems. The dark blue of deep ocean against the pale turquoise of shallow continental shelves. The white over the Atlantic. Christina Koch pressed her face against the glass. She had been to the International Space Station if she held the record for the longest single spaceflight by a woman, 328 days in low Earth orbit. She knew what Earth looked like from space. This was different. She said so late from the station. Earth is enormous. It fills your visual field. You feel close to it even when you are 400 kilometers above it. There is still a sense of proximity, of connection. As Orion fired its engine for the translunar injection burn, the maneuver that breaks you free from Earth orbit and aims you at the moon, that connection began to stretch, and then, over the hours that followed, too thin. The first thing on the changes is the size of Earth. In low Earth orbit, our planet fills approximately half your visual field when you look out the window. It is vast. It is immediate. It is undeniably the dominant feature of the universe outside the glass. At 10,000 kilometers from Earth, it still fills the window, but the edges are fully visible. You can see the whole disk. at 100,000 kilometers. Earth fits comfortably within a single window frame with dark space visible on all sides. By the time Orion reached the midpoint of its transit, approximately 192,000 kilometers from Earth, our planet had shrunk to the size of a large marble held at arm's length. Reed Wiseman photographed it through Orion's window on the 4th day of the mission. The image showed a small blue sphere surrounded by absolute black. Africa and Europe visible on one face. The northern lights faintly visible at the pole. He described it in a transmission to Mission Control. He said you could see the entire globe from pole to pole, that it was all there. Everything contained in something you could cover with your thumb. That specific sensation, the ability to occlude your entire home planet with a single extended finger, is something every astronaut who has traveled to deep space report. It is described uniformly as the most disorienting moment of the journey. Not frightening, exactly, but vertiginous in a way that has no equivalent on Earth. The sudden physical comprehension that the place containing everything you have ever loved, everyone you have ever known, every city and ocean and forest and human voice, can be hidden behind your hand. They crossed the 200,000 kilometer mark on day 3, then 210,000, then 220,000. The record they were approaching belonged to the Apollo 13 crew. Frank Lovell, Jack Swigert, and Fred Hayes. They had reached 248,655 miles from Earth in April 1970, and not by design. Their free return trajectory around the moon, the slingshot path that used lunar gravity to bring them home without a working engine, had carried them to that distance because an oxygen tank had exploded and crippled their spacecraft, and they had no other option. That record had stood for 54 years. Set in the worst moment of the most dangerous mission in the history of human spaceflight. A record nobody had tried to break because nobody had gone back. On day 4 of the Artemis II mission, Orion crossed 248,655 miles, then kept going. At closest approach to the moon, the spacecraft reached approximately 252,757 miles from Earth, 4,100 miles further than Apollo 13, further from home than any human being in the history of our species. The difference between those two records is not dramatic in the numbers. 4,000 miles, set against 250,000, is less than 2%. But the context of those two records is everything. Apollo 13 set its record because something went catastrophically wrong and the crew had to survive. Artemis II broke it because the mission was designed that way from the beginning. What was once an emergency flight path is now the primary architecture. Now, the moon. Every Apollo astronaut who orbited the moon described the moment of first visual contact with something approaching inadequacy. The photographs don't prepare you. The training doesn't prepare you. Nothing about living on Earth, where every surface has atmosphere above it, where edges are softened by haze and distance is measured by how things fade. None of that prepares you for the moon, as it actually appears from close range. There is no atmosphere, there is no haze, there is no softening of any edge anywhere. Craters that are hundreds of kilometers across are rendered in the same razor clarity as craters that are 10 meters wide. The terminator line, the boundary between lunar day and lunar night, does not fade. It is a hard geometric edge. Shadow and light divided with a precision that looks manufactured rather than natural. It looks, astronauts consistently report, like something that isn't real. The Artemis II crew experienced this differently from every Apollo crew before them, not from 70 miles above the surface, skimming close enough to watch individual craters scroll past beneath them, but from 4,600 miles away at closest approach, far enough that the entire lunar disk was visible at once, pole to pole, the full sphere, every mare, every highland, every impact base, every ray system from ancient collisions, the whole moon, in one window. No Apollo astronaut had ever seen that. Not one of them. The geometry of their missions, the low orbital altitude required for landing approach reconnaissance, meant they were always too close to see the whole picture. They saw strips of terrain, sections, details. Wiseman, Glover, Koch, and Hansen saw the complete face of the world that has governed Earth's tides since before life existed on our planet. All of it. At once. In the same field of E-view. Koch said later she kept returning to the window, that she would look away to perform a task and then look back as if she needed to confirm it was still there, that the completeness of it, the ability to see the entire object rather than a portion of it, changed something about how it felt, made it feel more real and less real simultaneously. More real because the scale was legible. Less real because nothing in human visual experience had prepared her brain to process a world as a single object sitting in a window. They saw something else, something no human eye had ever seen before. The Oriental Basin. It sits on the transition zone between the near side of the moon and the far side. A massive impact crater, approximately 600 miles across, formed roughly 3.9 billion years ago when something enormous struck the lunar surface with enough force to reshape the entire region. Robotic spacecraft have mapped it. Orbital cameras have photographed it. Scientists have studied its geology from data collected by instruments that have never needed eyes. But the Apollo missions were planned around near-side illumination. The geometry of their trajectories meant the Oriental region was always in shadow, or just beyond the edge of the visible disk during their closest approach. No Apollo astronaut ever looked at it directly. Artemis II's trajectory changed that. NASA confirmed in the days following closest approach that the crew had photographed the Oriental Basin through Orion's window. That, for the first time in history, human eyes had looked at a feature of the moon that only machines had seen before. Think about what that means. In an era when it feels as though every corner of Earth has been photographed, mapped, and catalogued, when satellite imagery has made even the most remote places visually familiar before anyone visits them. 4 people looked at something for the first time. Not a new planet, not a distant galaxy, something on the moon that has hung in the sky above every human civilization that has ever existed. The moon that shepherds have navigated by, and poets have written about, and children have pointed at since before recorded history. There was still something on it that no human had ever directly seen. 40 minutes. That is how long the crew spent behind the moon on the far side, out of contact with Earth. No signal in either direction. The lunar mass between them and every other human being in existence, blocking every radio wave, every laser communication link, every data transmission. The Apollo crews knew this. That silence. Every mission that went to the moon passed through it. Was, and remains, one of the few experiences of the space age the technology has not softened. You cannot engineer around the fact that the moon is a solid object that blocks radio waves. When you are behind it, you are simply unreachable. What has changed since Apollo is what that silence means. In 1969, the moon and waited. And the tension in that room was documented and has been written about and filmed. But it was still a gap in a mission where gaps meant potential catastrophe. For the Artemis II crew, the silence was different. Not because it was less complete. The signal was just as absent. But because the spacecraft carrying them through it is capable of flying itself, because the systems keeping them alive are more redundant, more reliable, and more thoroughly tested than anything, Apollo flew. Because the mission was designed with that silence built in as a normal operational phase rather than a managed risk. They floated in it for 40 minutes, 4 people, 250,000 miles from Earth. The sun on one side, that the silence behind the movement, the mission became real to him. Not the launch, not the view of Earth shrinking behind them. The silence, the 40 minutes when there was nothing, no voice from Houston, no data link, no connection to anything human except the 3 other people beside him. He said it was the most alone he had ever felt, and also, somehow, the least alone. They splashed down on April 11th. Recovery ships had been waiting for hours. Divers approached the bobbing capsule, opened the hatch, and helped 4 people climb out into Pacific sunlight they had not felt directly in 10 days. Victor Glover became the first person of color to travel beyond low Earth orbit. Christina Koch became the first woman. Jeremy Hansen became the first non-American citizen to reach that distance from Earth. Reed Wiseman became the commander of the mission that ended a 52-year absence from deep space. None of them came back the same. Not in ways that show up in a press conference, but in the data streaming off their bodies that researchers are still analyzing. In the radiation, their cells absorbed passing through the Van Allen belts twice. In the sleep patterns recorded during 10 nights at a distance that no human had experienced since 1972. Or in the cardiovascular data and the vision tests and the neurological assessments that will continue for months. And in something harder to measure, in the specific recalibration that happens to a human mind when it has looked at Earth from far enough away to cover it with a thumb, when it has seen the whole moon at once, a silence behind a world 250,000 miles from home, and understood, not intellectually, but physically, in the body, how large the universe is and how small we are inside it. They had reached the target. They had stood on the surface. The mission was accomplished. The Artemis II crew came home as something different, as people who had gone far enough to see the whole picture, who had looked back at the pale blue dot from the distance, where it finally fits in a window, who had carried the question of what comes next, Mars, the outer planets, all the way to the edge of lunar space and back. They are pathfinders. And the path they found leads somewhere we have not yet been. That is not nothing. That might be everything. Thanks for watching. See you in the next one.